Have you ever watched a game that left you feeling like you weren't just watching a sport, but rather a demonstration of how the world actually works? I'm talking about that feeling where the scoreboard tells one story, but your gut tells you something entirely different is going on beneath the surface. That is exactly what happened during the recent clash between Egypt and Argentina. It felt like it transcended a simple football match. It became a mirror reflecting some very uncomfortable truths about power, status, and who we choose to trust when the stakes are at their absolute highest.
It really did. When you look at a match like that, it is easy to get caught up in the immediate drama of a disallowed goal or a missed penalty. But if you step back, you realize Egypt didn't just play against 11 players in blue and white stripes. They ran headfirst into decades of football history, global prestige, and a deeply ingrained system that, quite frankly, finds it much easier to believe the established giant than the rising challenger from the African and Arab world. It is a classic case of the system protecting its own, even if no one is doing it consciously.
That is an important distinction to make right off the bat. We are not talking about a cartoon villain scenario here. We are not suggesting a referee woke up in the morning and decided to actively sabotage one team. The reality is actually much more subtle, and because of that, much more dangerous. How do we explain this without falling into simple conspiracy theories?
You have to look at psychology. What we are seeing is a textbook example of implicit bias. These are the unconscious associations that we all carry around in our heads, shaped by culture, media, and history. When a referee is out there on the pitch, operating under immense pressure with 80,000 screaming fans and millions watching at home, their brain has to make split-second decisions. They don't have time for a philosophical debate. So, the brain relies on shortcuts, and those shortcuts are paved with assumptions about who belongs at the top and who is just visiting.
So, when Argentina walks onto the field, they aren't just 11 athletes. They are wearing a shirt that carries the myth of World Cups, legendary players, and global adoration. They are football royalty. Meanwhile, Egypt walks out carrying the label of the underdog, the outsider. How does that identity difference actually change how a referee interprets a physical challenge or a protest?
It changes everything because of something psychologists call the halo effect. This is where our overall impression of someone influences how we judge their specific actions. Because Argentina has this aura of historic success and elite professionalism, their actions are viewed through a positive lens. When an Argentine player complains to the referee, it is seen as leadership, tactical maturity, or game management. But when an Egyptian player does the exact same thing, the subconscious brain of the official might register it as emotional instability, dissent, or desperation.
It is the classic double standard, isn't it? If the famous team makes hard physical contact, it is labeled as strength and competitive intensity. If the challenger does it, it is labeled as a reckless foul.
Exactly. The famous shirt gets the benefit of the doubt, while the outsider has to prove their innocence over and over again. And this is where those mental shortcuts, or heuristics, become dangerous. The brain of the official thinks, Argentina are champions. They know how to win cleanly. Egypt are fighting above their weight, so they must be panicking. Suddenly, the match is no longer being played on a level playing field. One team is treated as the rightful owner of the stadium, and the other is treated like a guest who should just be happy to be invited.
It makes you wonder about the narrative we build around these teams. We often hear commentators talk about South American or European teams as being tactically disciplined and intelligent, while African and Arab teams are described as physical, chaotic, or playing with passion. That language isn't harmless, is it?
Not at all. That language shapes the entire ecosystem. It sets the expectations. When we constantly frame certain regions as emotional or chaotic, we train everyone, including referees, to look for evidence that confirms those stereotypes. That is confirmation bias in action. If you expect a team to lose control, you will interpret their intensity as a loss of control. If you expect the other team to be composed, you will interpret their time wasting as professional experience. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's talk about the technology, because for years, we were told that VAR would fix all of this. The promise of the video assistant referee was absolute objectivity. But it feels like VAR hasn't actually eliminated the human element. It has just hidden it behind a screen.
That is one of the biggest illusions in modern sports. People talk about VAR as if it is an objective machine, like a goal line sensor that gives a simple yes or no. But VAR is still operated by human beings. A human being has to decide which camera angle to look at. A human being has to decide if a contact is significant enough to warrant overturning a decision. They have to decide if a mistake is clear and obvious. If the people in the VAR room carry the same unconscious biases as the referee on the field, the technology doesn't solve the problem. It just gives bias a polished, high-tech stamp of approval. It makes the unequal treatment look official.
And the pressure in that VAR room must be immense. Think about the commercial and political stakes. If you make a controversial call that eliminates a global superstar and a massive football brand like Argentina, the fallout is global. The headlines will scream about it for weeks. But if you make a controversial call against Egypt, the global media cycle moves on much faster. The system expects Egypt to accept the defeat and go home quietly.
You are touching on prestige bias here. We naturally defer to high status. FIFA, the sponsors, the broadcasters, they all have a vested interest in the continuation of the established narrative. A tournament without its biggest stars is a tournament that loses viewership and revenue. Now, I am not saying there is a directive from the top telling referees to protect certain teams. But that commercial pressure, that fear of being the person who sent a giant home, sits silently in the room. It influences the threshold of what is considered a foul or a penalty. The cost of making a mistake against a superstar feels much higher than the cost of making a mistake against an underdog.
It really forces us to ask some uncomfortable questions. What if the badges were reversed? What if it was Egypt's star player who went down in the box under the exact same circumstances? Would the referee have hesitated? Would the VAR room have checked it with the same scrutiny? If the answers to those questions make us hesitate, then we don't have a fair system.
We don't. A rule that is applied differently based on who is performing the action is not a rule. It is a privilege. Egypt didn't ask for special treatment. They didn't ask for favors. They just asked for the same whistle. They asked for the same standard of review. When you deny a team that consistency, you are denying them basic fairness. And that is why this particular match resonated so deeply across Africa and the Arab world. It wasn't just about football tactics. It felt like a reenactment of a global dynamic, where the global South has to work twice as hard to get half the credit.
It is that feeling of being tolerated as an inspiring story, but only up to a point. The football establishment loves a good underdog story. They love the narrative of a team overcoming the odds to reach the tournament. But the moment that underdog actually threatens to defeat the royalty, the tone changes. The establishment gets nervous.
Because it threatens the hierarchy. Football's power structure is built on predictability and the preservation of status. When Egypt showed up and played with absolute fearlessness, refusing to accept the role of the polite participant, they disrupted the script. They showed that they weren't there to just be a heartwarming footnote in Argentina's journey. They were there to win. And when the system reacted by leaning toward the famous shirt in the critical moments, it exposed the fragility of the level playing field myth.
So how do we move forward from this? If the problem is systemic and psychological, we can't just fire a few referees and pretend the issue is solved. How does an organization like FIFA actually address implicit bias and prestige bias?
First, they have to acknowledge that it exists. For a long time, the response to refereeing criticism has been to defend the officials at all costs and treat every mistake as an isolated incident. That has to stop. Referees need comprehensive training that goes beyond the rule book. They need cognitive bias training. They need to understand how their brains process pressure, how reputation influences their perception of fouls, and how cultural stereotypes affect their decision-making.
That sounds like a good step, but what about accountability during the match itself? How do we make the decision-making process transparent?
Transparency is key. Right now, the VAR process is a black box. The fans in the stadium and the viewers at home are left in the dark while referees whisper to each other through headsets. We need to hear those conversations. If a decision is made to disallow a goal or deny a penalty, the audio of the referee and the VAR team should be broadcast live. Let us hear the reasoning. If they have nothing to hide, then transparency should not be a threat. It would actually protect the referees from accusations of bias if they can explain their logic in real time.
And what about the data? We live in an era of sports analytics where every single pass, run, and shot is tracked. Surely we can track refereeing decisions too?
Absolutely. We need to start analyzing the patterns, not just individual matches. Which regions are consistently on the receiving end of controversial VAR decisions? Are certain teams statistically more likely to get the benefit of the doubt in 50-50 situations? If the data shows a persistent bias toward high-status teams, then FIFA can no longer dismiss these complaints as mere sour grapes. The numbers would force a systemic reform.
It really comes down to what we value more, the protection of the brand or the integrity of the sport. If football wants to claim it is a global game that unites the world, it has to treat every nation with the same respect.
Exactly. Respect is earned, but fairness should be guaranteed. When a team like Egypt puts in years of preparation, when players sacrifice everything to represent their country on the world stage, they deserve to know that their fate will be decided by their performance, not by the weight of their opponent's history.
As we wrap up this discussion, I keep thinking about the legacy of this match. On paper, it will go down as a victory for the favorites. But in the minds of those who watched it closely, it feels like a turning point. It highlighted that the struggle for equality in sports is mirroring the struggle for equality in the wider world.
It is a reminder that bias doesn't always show up with loud, overt hostility. Sometimes it is quiet. It is a slow whistle, a decision to not look at the monitor, a subtle shift in the benefit of the doubt. Egypt may have lost the match, but they won the argument. They forced us to look at the machinery of prestige and ask if we are truly satisfied with a system that protects the powerful at the expense of the outsider. Until we can answer that question honestly, every victory by a giant will carry an asterisk, and every defeat of an underdog will leave us asking, what if the shirts were reversed?